Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Global Day of Jewish Learning. My name's Nora Katz, and I'm really excited to be your guide on our exploration of pilgrimage today. So first, I want to give you some background. I serve as the Director of Heritage and Interpretation at the Goldring-Woldenberg Institute of Southern Jewish Life in Jackson, Mississippi. We're a trans-denominational organization serving a 13-state southern region with educational services, rabbinical services, cultural programs, community engagement, and history and heritage programming. And our vision is of a Jewish South in which every Jewish person, no matter where they live, has access to excellent Jewish resources. So as Director of Heritage and Interpretation at the ISJL, I interpret and share the rich legacy of Jewish life in the American South through public programs, trips and tours, shared experiences, and more. So part of my job involves working with groups from congregations, Hillels, and other organizations around the world to plan trips to the Jewish South. So groups do things like spending Shabbat with Southern Jewish congregations. They'll visit museums and historic sites. They'll spend time in nature, enjoy music and art, eat amazing meals, and gain firsthand experiences of Southern Jewish history, civil rights history, and contemporary Southern life. And it's a really amazing privilege to work with these groups to give them authentic, meaningful experiences of the South through a Jewish lens. So we use the word pilgrimage pretty often to describe these trips, and we just throw it around. I, frankly, throw it around because it looks fantastic in marketing copy, but I want to challenge us not to make light of it, to open it up and explore and explode it and sort of see what's inside. So a few housekeeping things as we're getting started. You can go to theglobalday.org/KATZ18, that's K-A-T-Z, to download the source sheet or handout for this talk if you want to follow along. And I really encourage you to get involved in the comments section under this YouTube video. You can ask questions and respond to things. And I'm going to have a period toward the end of the talk where I answer some of those questions and respond to some comments. So know that I will absolutely get to those. So I want to practice this virtual audience participation with you with a question that I'd love for you to answer. And I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about it. What do you think about when you hear the word pilgrimage? Okay, so we have a couple initial responses coming in. One is religious fervor. One is long distances. Now, I'll admit, I did this survey about a week or so ago with my colleagues at the ISJL, and people came up with a lot of really interesting responses. So one person said, it's not a term you hear all that often. And I think that's true, right? It's something that we see as sort of old-fashioned, a thing of the past, something we associate with like medieval times. But of course, people make pilgrimages all the time today. So a lot of my colleagues immediately thought about Mecca and the annual pilgrimage there. People also talked about, of course, because we're getting to that time of year, Thanksgiving and the pilgrims coming over to the United States on the Mayflower. People talked a lot about walking and how they associate pilgrimage with, something you do on foot. A lot of people talked about, the fact that it was associated with holy sites and that it was something that you might do as a community. So I think those are all a lot of different interesting responses. And as we're going through the talk today, if you think of other responses to the word pilgrimage, I'd love to hear them. So definitely continue participating in the YouTube comments. So I'm really especially interested in the work that I do at the ISJL because of my background as a public historian. That's how I would generally describe the job that I'm currently doing. I'm passionate about the intersection between history, memory, and place. And I'm especially passionate about the ways in which collective memory is inscribed in historic sites and community gathering spaces. So when I was thinking about this talk, all of these ideas started crystallizing for me. And I started thinking about this concept of contemporary tourists in the 21st century as pilgrims. And I liked the idea so much that I brought it to work with me, and I sat down and I thought about the tours that I plan for people and the requests that these groups make for their trips and the experiences that these groups have in the South. And I realized that I was facilitating pilgrimages, and it really moved me. So I thought that there might be more to explore, and I was thrilled to have a forum to do it in. So this is our thesis for today. Mindful travelers can choose to be pilgrims and can choose to make pilgrimages. When we think of ourselves as pilgrims and use the imagery of pilgrimage, we're able to have more meaningful travel experiences, make deeper connections with the people and places we visit, and bring inspiration and action back to our home communities. So today, in this next hour we have together, we're going to critically explore what it means to be a pilgrim. We're going to ask some questions about the term and throw around some ideas about what we can learn from the imagery of pilgrimage. So to give some structure to this exploration, I've developed a series of big statements about the concept of pilgrimage that we're going to discuss one by one. And those are outlined along with some key quotes from different texts in your handouts, which once again, you can download from theglobalday.org/KATZ18. So the first big broad statement we're going to play around with is that pilgrimage is a good keyword. So I really hate it when lectures and speeches start with a dictionary definition. I think that at best, it's a tired strategy, and at worst, it's a lazy cop-out. But I'm going to use this tactic anyway because I'm obsessed with the Oxford English Dictionary, the online version of which you can likely access using your library card number. And I think it's going to help us parse the word pilgrim in a really interesting way so we can all get on the same page moving forward. So the initial definition of the word pilgrim as a noun is a person on a journey, a person who travels from place to place, a traveler, a wanderer, an itinerant. Also in early use, a foreigner, an alien, a stranger. So the initial thought that someone had in the YouTube comments associated with the word pilgrimage was religious fervor. A lot of my colleagues were talking about pilgrims, whether to Mecca or, the pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower, who are making explicitly religious pilgrimages, right? But the initial definition of the word pilgrim is not religious at all, which I think is really interesting. The Oxford English Dictionary gives us some examples of this version of the word in use throughout history. So an example from 1914 says, quote, "He climbed to the top deck and now he could again see his brother pilgrim, the moon." So first of all, I just love this imagery, but I think it also has to do with sort of the idea of a pilgrim as someone just like at a base level on a journey, and the moon also on a journey around the earth. Another example from 1991 is, quote, "Pilgrim by name, pilgrim by nature, came the day the wanderlust seized him by the throat again," end quote. So this one really struck me because it gave me this idea of pilgrimage as maybe something that's addictive, as a key part of someone's personality. And it made me think about, once a pilgrim, are we always a pilgrim? So the second definition that the Oxford English Dictionary, or OED, gives us is one that I think is a little bit more at top of mind when we think of the word pilgrim. So it's a person who makes a journey, usually of a long distance, to a sacred place as an act of religious devotion. So we hear about this definition of the word in Shakespeare, Milton, and Chaucer. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is, of course, a collection of stories about a group of pilgrims taking the journey from London to Canterbury Cathedral to pay their respects at the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. So this really foundational work of English literature about a group of pilgrims who definition of religious devotion. And in extended use, it's a person who makes a journey to visit a place of particular significance or interest, especially as an act of homage, respect, etc. So again, that's sort of a more religious definition. What's really interesting to me is this third definition under this noun that I think broadens it out even further. So originally and chiefly in religious contexts, a person traveling through life, especially one who undertakes a course of spiritual development leading towards heaven, a state of blessedness, etc., a person who experiences life as a sojourn, exile, or period of estrangement from such a state. So again, this is sort of that religious definition, but then broadened out to someone's entire life. So rather than pilgrimage being something that's a specific trip, your pilgrimage can be your entire existence. And I think that that's really interesting. There are examples of this word from Emerson and Hawthorne, both of whom were sort of existing in the same cultural period. There's a great quote from Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Scarlet Letter, where Arthur Dimmesdale is sort of making an argument about how he had envisioned himself before he sort of broke his society's norms in his tryst with Hester Prynne. And he says, "A gleam along my earthly track, whereby the pilgrims that shall come after me may be guided to the regions of the blessed." So he's referring to himself as a pilgrim in his general existence. And I think that's a great example of this definition. So in the Oxford English Dictionary, underneath a word's definition, there will be a list of phrases that use that word. And one that really stuck out to me was pilgrim's way, which is defined as a route followed by pilgrims traveling to a shrine, a well-established route to a particular shrine, especially that of St. Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral, England. So again, Canterbury Cathedral comes up. And there are really famous pilgrimage routes in the world. That is definitely one of them. The Camino de Santiago that people make through Spain is definitely one of them. Various routes to Mecca are absolutely one of them. So we do have existing established pilgrimage routes that contemporary folks use in our world. But what Pilgrim's Way really gives us is this idea that pilgrimage requires a set route that others have traveled and that others are going to travel after us. So route is a key aspect of this whole endeavor, and I want us to keep that in mind today. So I bet you're thinking, Nora, what is the etymology of the word pilgrim? And frankly, I'm thrilled that you asked, and I'm wondering why it took you this long. Pilgrim comes from the Latin peregrinus, which is an adjective meaning coming from foreign parts. There are a variety of different definitions tacked onto that. And as a noun in Latin, it meant a foreigner, a free resident having no rights of citizenship, or a pilgrim. So pilgrim and peregrine, the English word peregrine, have the same root word and some really interesting overlapping definitions that I think can be productive for us in this discussion. So my favorite dictionary, of course, tells us that the noun peregrine with a capital P is a red-skinned variety of peach with white flesh developed in Herefordshire, England in 1903. But you're probably aware of the word from peregrine falcon. These are incredible birds that nest on mountains and cliffs. And they're known for being some of the fastest animals on the planet. I remember reading somewhere like their dive can get to like hundreds of miles an hour. And so they're really known for the way that they move. So I think that sort of fits into this whole pilgrim conversation we're having. The word peregrine means foreign, outlandish, strange, imported from abroad, and also occasionally extraneous to the matter at hand. So that's something that we really have to reckon with as travelers, right? The fact that maybe the places that we visit don't need us as much as we need them. So I'm thinking especially of really amazing landscapes. And I'm really thinking about Mount Everest. This is not at all a Southern Jewish example, but Mount Everest has long been a definite destination for mountain climbing pilgrims. It's the tallest mountain in the world. It's in a harsh climate, and it does not need us to climb it. And hundreds of people have died trying. But there are some places, I'm thinking about museums, historic sites, congregations, whose meaning is made by people visiting and spending time there. And those places really benefit from our presence. So I think that is a balance we have to strike and something we have to be aware of as travelers. In the field of astrology, peregrine refers to a planet that's situated in part of a zodiac where it has none of its essential dignities. Now, I will admit that when I first read this, I had no idea what any of that meant. But dignity in astrology means the situation of a planet in which its influence is heightened either by its position in the zodiac or by its aspects with other planets. So this is the idea that a planet has a new meaning and a different purpose because it is out of place. So I think that pilgrimage is all about putting ourselves out of place. And I want us to go to a space where we have none of our essential dignities. So there are a lot of other really interesting definitions of the word peregrine, but the gist of this is that it's pretty parallel to the word pilgrim. In fact, one definition is a pilgrim. And so I think that there are a lot of like etymological, really cool ways to think about the idea of pilgrimage that are all going to be productive as we consider contemporary tourists as pilgrims. So my obsession with etymologies is really founded on a love of words, and it's a love that I share with Henry David Thoreau, who is the famed author of Walden and Civil Disobedience, which are works that I love despite their self-righteousness and basis on tonally unacknowledged privilege. But my favorite Thoreau work is his essay Walking that he published in The Atlantic in 1862. I bet many of you have heard of it. The essay advocates Thoreau's deep-seated belief in the importance of walking in nature, and it's full of lofty ideas and big proclamations. So Thoreau says, quote, "I have met with but one or two persons in the course of my life who understood the art of walking, that is, of taking walks, who had a genius, so to speak, for sauntering, which word is beautifully derived from idle people who roved about the country in the Middle Ages and asked charity, under pretense of going à la Santerre to the Holy Land, till the children exclaimed, 'There goes a Santerre, a Saunterer, a Holy Lander.'" You'll excuse my horrible pronunciation of French. So I'm not suggesting that we all do as Thoreau instructs us in his essay, which is basically to leave our homes and families behind for years of endless wandering. Thoreau couldn't even do that. He lived in a cabin he built on his friend's property. He went to their house for dinner every night, and he had his aunt do his laundry. But I think that Thoreau's example offers us two really instructive points. So the first is that even the word sauntering has a religious root. And again, we're connecting walking and pilgrimage, which is important. And the second is that we actually need not venture far to have spiritual experiences with travel. Many American congregations take really expensive and lengthy annual trips to Israel, to Europe, to other faraway places. And those tours are incredibly meaningful. But we can also find really deep meaning in our own backyards. And there are incredible, infinite, differing landscapes in the United States that are inhabited by diverse and engaging people building communities with myriad strengths and challenges. So my challenge to us is that we should saunter to them once in a while too, and recognize the cultural wealth of places we might not have considered before. Thoreau's huge spiritual experience in nature that he documented in Walden took place in the town, in the state where he grew up. And so I think that we can absolutely create spiritual pilgrimage experiences for ourselves just right outside our front doors. But for the record, my best friend, the Oxford English Dictionary, contradicts Thoreau's etymology of the word saunterer. It comes from the Old French aventurer, which has the same root as the word adventurer, and adventure. And I think that that also works for me. Okay, so all of that is to say, we've established that the word pilgrim is going to work for us in this discussion. So I want to take us to our second big, broad statement, which is that pilgrimage is a complicated choice. So this one is kind of a subcategory of the definitions section, because I think that the idea of daring and risk being important parts of the definition of pilgrimage warrants a subsection. So I really owe the genesis of this talk to the work of Zygmunt Bauman, who was a 20th century Polish sociologist and public intellectual who was often chiefly concerned with the nature and challenges of modernity. And Bauman writes about pilgrimage as a concept that might not work in the contemporary world. Bauman relies on some pretty harshly demarcated divides between the modern and the postmodern, which I don't necessarily find reflective of historical realities, but I want to let that slide because of the other amazing things he has to say. So Bauman talks about the shifting nature of identity and how the postmodern world has caused uncertainty and complexity in our personal identities. And to do this, he presents us with the image of the pilgrim as an ancient figure walking through the Roman Empire to the pathways of medieval Europe to transatlantic passageways to the United States. Thanksgiving, the Mayflower Pilgrim. In the medieval world, pilgrimage was a heroic or saintly choice, says Bauman. But in the modern world, Bauman suggests, quote, "Pilgrimage is what one does of necessity, to avoid being lost in a desert, to invest the land with no destination. Being a pilgrim then walk, one can walk to. One can look back at the footprints left in the sand and see them as a road. One can reflect on the road past and see it as a progress towards, an advance, a coming closer to. One can make a distinction between behind and ahead, and plot the road ahead as a succession of footprints yet to pockmark the land without features. Destination, the set purpose of life's pilgrimage, gives form to the formless, makes a whole out of the fragmentary, lends continuity to the episodic. So the seeming permanency of the modern world, according to Bauman, was hospitable to people's need to build legacies and institutions and identities. He says, quote, "The world of pilgrims, of identity builders, must be orderly, determined, predictable, ensured. But above all, it must be a kind of world in which footprints are engraved for good, so that the trace and record of past travels are kept and preserved." So that all sounds great, right? The definitions of pilgrimage that we just explored fit really well into this paradigm. Pilgrimage requires defined pathways and opportunities to leave our marks on those pathways, just like those who came before us. Pilgrims can easily see the progress they've made because they can turn back and see the footprints they've left in the proverbial sand. But Bauman argues that in the postmodern or contemporary context, the fabric of our world is made of that sand. He says, "The desert, though comfortingly featureless for those who seek to make their mark, does not hold features well." And then he says, my favorite line from this whole piece, "Whatever you build in the sand is unlikely to be a castle." So Bauman's assertion that our contemporary pilgrimages can't be so permanent is a really interesting challenge for us. Knowing that we're not necessarily making a permanent impact with a week-long trip to a Southern Jewish community, how do we make meaning for ourselves and, most importantly, serve these communities? So these are questions that I consider really often when I work with groups on our alternative break program in the Mississippi Delta. So college groups from across the United States spend a week in Mississippi learning about the Deep South's distinct and complex history. They visit historic civil rights sites, spend time with Southern Jewish congregations, and engage with the local community in meaningful service. When the ISJL began this program a number of years ago, we were very consciously emulating and learning from a really specific historical moment, which was Freedom Summer in 1964. So many of you may have heard of Freedom Summer, but I want to give you a brief overview. In the summer of 1964, Mississippi's Council of Federated Organizations, which was an umbrella organization linking a lot of individual civil rights organizations in Mississippi, including the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, and the Congress of Racial Equality. COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, recruited nearly 1,000 college students, mostly from the North, to join the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement for 10 weeks over the summer. So the idea was to get disenfranchised Black voters and young Mississippians involved in the civil rights movement, and to get enough Black voters registered to unseat the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey that August. So through voter registration drives, freedom schools, and freedom school newspapers, these volunteers followed the needs and leadership of local organizers about really important change in Mississippi. So approximately half of the white Freedom Summer volunteers were Jewish. They were coming to the South from northern universities and engaging in activism in this way for the first time. Many of them were obviously very active in their home communities. Two New York Jews, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, along with their friend James Chaney, who was a Black Mississippian, were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan early in the summer, before the majority of the volunteers had arrived in Mississippi. And Freedom Summer was marked by frustration and tragedy, and it had a lasting impact on both volunteers and the communities they served. And it was also a crystallizing moment in Mississippi's and the South's struggle for civil rights. So when I work with college students who are traveling to Mississippi, usually for the first time, we talk about Freedom Summer. We talk about the courage that it took to hear about Goodman, Chaney, and Schwerner's murders and then still decide to join the fight. The Freedom Summer volunteers were in training, I believe in Ohio, when Goodman, Chaney, and Schwerner, who had arrived early, disappeared. They weren't found for 6 weeks, but everyone knew that they had been killed. And Bob Moses, who was one of the leaders of Freedom Summer, talked to the gathered volunteers and said, "I need you all to call home, and I need you to make a decision about whether you're still going to come with us." And I believe only one person decided to stay behind. That's a really powerful thing. So we talk about the networks of activists and organizers on the ground who made the summer possible. We talk about the qualities that organizers were looking for in volunteers and the unfinished work that they left behind when they returned to school at the end of the summer. So we see Freedom Summer as a model for meaningful service in Mississippi today. We're inspired by its local leadership, its focus on a larger common goal, and its emphasis on effective training. But it's really, really easy for service learning to turn into voluntourism. So that's volunteering in communities as a means of feeling good about ourselves, making our vacations more meaningful, or getting a great photo opportunity. That's the worst. But meaningful service can't be self-serving, and it can't be done with the expectation that an outsider's week-long experience in Mississippi is going to fundamentally change the lives of people impacted by their service. It just doesn't work like that. We need to move to a model of ethical, mindful service that's led by community leaders within frameworks that already exist on the ground. That's the only way to make meaningful change. I absolutely see the Freedom Summer volunteers as pilgrims. They were traveling to the Deep South to work for civil rights at a time when many people who looked like them were at best ambivalent about the struggle for liberation. Black organizers in Mississippi knew that getting white folks involved with the movement would draw far more media attention than they had received before. And that was cynical, but it absolutely worked. The really harsh and difficult reality is that the investigation surrounding Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney was far more thorough and active than it would have been had the bodies of the three victims been Black. Many other people disappeared or were killed who were civil rights workers that summer. There's a reason that Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney got more attention. So activists knew that they had to pull a certain demographic of pilgrims to make Freedom Summer as effective as possible, and it totally worked. So all of this is to say that pilgrimage isn't without risk, and it isn't always the perfect, cathartic, transformational experience that we want it to be. But there are some other ways to think about travel. So this takes us to our next big sweeping statement. Pilgrimage isn't the only answer. So Zygmunt Bauman, our old friend, presents four models of what he sees as the four models for contemporary travelers. So these are the stroller, the vagabond, the tourist, and the player. These are really fun names, and I promise you the descriptions are only a little bit depressing. So the stroller moves through life as a series of episodes, experiencing encounters without context or consequence. Strolling involves leisure, detachment, and freedom from entanglements with other people. The vagabond has no set destination, instead patching together an itinerary as they go. The vagabond has no roots and is always a stranger in a strange land. Bauman argues that the vagabond is driven by hope, that is, hopes unfulfilled in the past and hope for the future. The tourist moves with purpose, seeking comfortable and safe experiences with the illusion of risk. So I can't see you, but raise your hand if you've ever traveled like this. I certainly have once or twice. It's easy, it's way too easy to be a tourist because the world is laid out in front of you and we can seek prepackaged experiences. The player, this last model, wants to stay one step ahead of their environment, relying on and trying to control chance and luck, making calculations about every interaction and movement. Players embrace their lives and travels as a game, making calculations, and there's no time for deep engagement or cooperation with other players. So Bauman seems really cynical, right? That these are the only four ways that we can travel. I happen to think that people throughout history have been curious, thoughtful travelers, and Bauman's models are almost ahistorical, but I want to give them a chance for a moment to prove a larger point. Which is that there's no room in these models for earnestness, companionship, or authenticity. And it reminds me of the detachment that we feel all too often in the landscape of social media. We see sound bites and images devoid of context and meaning, meant to project public personas that are very different from our private selves. Collecting Instagrammable experiences without companionship and context is meaningless. When we travel, I want us to seek experiences that challenge us, that make us uncomfortable, that leave us with questions, that help us see the world through other people's eyes. And while we're at it, let's take unflattering, gritty, silly, amazing professional travelers. So another travel mode that I want to throw out there is the idea of the flaneur. This is a fancy late 19th century term referring to a specific sort of gentlemanly traveler, always a gentleman, at least at first, exploring the city, always a Western European city, at least at first, with a critical and observational eye. Flânerie which is the noun form of this word, of course, is a way of experiencing the city from a critical and sometimes detached perspective. So think about writers, artists, poets, travel journalists, James Joyce, and others who are able to perceive and document the world around them in interesting ways. Flaneurs are curious and open-minded, but they're able to use their skills to think on a meta level about their experiences and how they fit into the specific places in which they occur. So flânerie is about spontaneity and letting oneself wander and explore even familiar places with new eyes. A lot of the travel that I plan for groups happens in non-urban spaces, but I think we can take some lessons from the flaneur. We can be open to what's around us and take time to think critically about what we're experiencing. It might be exhausting, but it can also open up new possibilities. So, for example, let's think deeply about the ways in which a local guide is talking about a moment in history and compare them to the ways another local person is talking to us about that same moment in history. Let's ask questions about why an object label in a museum is worded the way it is. Let's look at landscapes and consider the ways in which the people we meet relate to them. So I want us to borrow 50% of what the flaneur does. That is, being critical without pretending that we can be detached. So here's the crux of the argument. No matter the myriad models we use or the stilted postmodern argument we make, I think it's productive to think of these tours as pilgrimages. If for no other reason, then it helps us put our experiences into the broader context of Jews and others moving through the South, seeking experiences, fighting for justice, and building community. So that takes us to our next big sweeping statement. This is a reminder that you can ask questions at any point, and I'm going to answer them at the end. Our next big sweeping statement is that pilgrimage forces us to think deeply about the places we visit. So to go on a pilgrimage, we have to think of the places we visit as holy places, as holy sites, as sites of memory. So this is a concept I'm lifting from the amazing work of Pierre Nora, who I love for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that when I write his name down, it looks like I'm talking about myself in the third person. He talks about the concept of lieu de mémoire, yet another great French term, which translates to sites of memory or realms of memory. And he talks about those often and most exhaustively in the context of French revolutionary history, which I would say is at best tangential to what we're talking about today. But Nora was writing in a time when historians were feeling the past slipping away from the public. And the idea of memory studies was coming to the fore as a result of many intersecting factors, one of many, was identity building surrounding Holocaust survivors and their descendants. So this conversation is really happening sort of starting in the late 60s through the mid 70s. Zygmunt Bauman wrote his piece about pilgrimage in the early 90s. So that sort of period is what we're talking about here, that intellectual moment. So the term site of memory refers to a place that's imbued with significance because of its association with an important historical moment, collective memory, or aspect of community identity. So think of museums, monuments, certain streets or parks, historic landmarks, but also archives and even symbols or colors, anything that represents an important element of communal or national identity. These can be contested sites or even fictional sites imbued with layers of meaning as they are necessary to the people who use them. So I think about this concept all the time when I'm planning trips. As someone whose graduate work was intimately concerned with sites of memory, specifically performance happening in politically loaded and traumatic sites of memory, I feel intellectually right at home in places like the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama. Colloquially known as the Lynching Memorial, this incredible tribute to victims of the brutality of white supremacy is anything but a comfortable, comforting space. Instead, we're confronted with the stark reality of the terror and violence inflicted on Black bodies since before the founding of the United States. But this place is absolutely a site of memory. It's calling upon the lives and legacies of those who were murdered, and it's calling upon sort of this rich tradition of trying to understand and fight and resist this reality. So I get to send people to all kinds of amazing places on these Southern Jewish Heritage Tours. Temple B'nai Israel in Natchez, Mississippi, which is home to the oldest Jewish community in the state. Temple Mishkan Israel in Selma, Alabama, which is just a few blocks from the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, the first state-sponsored civil rights museum in the country, and its incredible sister museum, the Museum of Mississippi History. Go Jackson. The Port of Galveston, where thousands of immigrants set foot on American soil for the first time. Incredible art museums in Arkansas, New Orleans, Texas, South Carolina. The Blue Ridge Mountains and the Appalachians, sites of struggle and resistance in Jackson, Mississippi, Atlanta, Georgia, Memphis, Tennessee, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Montgomery, Alabama. I could go on. These places are deeply Southern, and they inform every aspect of my work as Director of Heritage and Interpretation at the ISJL. And I want to make sure that travelers respect and honor these places, even as they think critically about them. I want to make sure that we recognize the deep meaning and emotion and pain and joy and complexity that's embedded in these places. That's really hard, and I want to help people through it. So thinking about all of these important sites of memory makes it very obvious that public space is deeply political. So that's something that's incredibly true in the civil rights movement, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but it remains true today, and it's something that we have to consider as we move through unfamiliar public spaces. So how are we taking up space? How can we make space for those who don't have access to it? So this challenge to both take up space and to recognize the privilege we have as people who are allowed to take up space as tourists fits into the ever-present imperative of tikkun olam, or the imperative to repair the world. So how can we repair the world in a way that puts space and place at the forefront? How can we engage in social justice work that is inextricably linked to sites of resistance and sites of memory? So I want to make some Jewish connections, and this takes us to our next big broad statement: pilgrimage is Jewish. So this week, coincidentally, we're reading Parsha Lech Lecha, which is of course intimately concerned with movement and travel and going forth. And it begins with God saying to Abraham, then Abram, "Go forth from your land and from the place of your birth and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you." So in Lech Lecha, Abraham not only leaves his native land and the place where he was born, but he leaves the comfort of childhood, family, and community. That's an enormous challenge. It's not just a physical move away from the land of his youth. It's a plunge into the unknown with no promise of return. And Abraham had a pretty harrowing, difficult journey. A lot of really awful things happened to him. Abram's journey alters the entire future of the Jewish people, which is some pilgrimage. I'm also really interested in the terminology surrounding teshuvah, or repentance. And it's a theme that we touched on a few weeks ago during Yom Kippur. Teshuvah also means returning. Returning from what? Well, one of the Hebrew words for sin is chet, which means to go astray. So repenting is a return to goodness, justice, righteousness. It's really fascinating to me that we have this imagery of going forth in regards to negative behavior. So we can think of pilgrimage as going away from home to new and unfamiliar places, like Canaan in Abram's case, or destructive actions in the case of the Yom Kippur liturgy. But we can also think of pilgrimage as homecoming, as a returning to a place that brings us peace and comfort. So that's what teshuvah means for me. It's a return home to self-reflection and just action. Luckily for this pilgrim imagery that I'm trying to conjure up today, returning home can also be a meaningful journey or a pilgrimage. So here's something else that's Jewish that we're doing today, is drawing on a lot of different intellectual strains. And I think that with these Southern Jewish Heritage Tours, I really want us to take advantage of the opportunities this region affords us for personal reflection, community building, and moments of inspiration. So here are some examples of some reflective Jewish experiences that you might have in the South. Experiencing a traditional thermal bath in Hot Springs, Arkansas, and considering the ways in which the 19th century narratives surrounding bathing's restorative properties might intersect with narratives surrounding the mikveh experience. Sampling a reflective Havdalah service Jewish experience. making a minyan and leading services at a Southern congregation with only a handful of congregants. That's one of the most amazing things that I get to help make happen, which is there are some congregations in our region that have fewer than 10 members. And so when a group comes along, suddenly the congregation may have doubled or tripled in size. And if that group is traveling with clergy, they will often lead services at congregations without full-time rabbinical services. The most meaningful Jewish moments in these tours for me are the moments when we can take quintessentially Southern experiences and turn them into Jewish experiences. So again, I have to reiterate, pilgrimage is Jewish. So our next big sweeping statement is taking us out on a limb a little bit. And so I hope that you will join me on this limb. Maybe we can make a pilgrimage to the end of this limb together. And this big sweeping statement is that pilgrimage is musical. So music pilgrimages are really common. We send groups to Preservation Hall in New Orleans, sites along the Mississippi Blues Trail like the B.B. King Museum in Indianola, Mississippi, Dollywood in Tennessee, and Graceland and Sun Studio and the Stax Museum in Memphis. And it's no secret that Southern music is foundational to American popular music, from 19th century church songs to minstrelsy to the blues. And so I really like to make music a priority on most of the tours I plan. Around the world, not just in the US, people visit sites associated with their favorite bands and musicians. Top of mind for me is all the recreations of the iconic album cover for Abbey Road. People make a pilgrimage to Abbey Road, and they make a pilgrimage across that crosswalk, which I think is awesome. But the imagery of pilgrimage is present in music and pop culture too. And you'll see all the songs I'm going to talk about on your handout if you want to follow along. Lift Every Voice and Sing was first performed in Jacksonville, Florida in 1900 by children at a segregated school marking Abraham Lincoln's birthday. It became the official song of the NAACP and is known by many as the Black National Anthem. This song I immediately thought of as I began my work and research on pilgrimage, and so I really wanted to share it. I want to highlight the song's second verse. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with a steady beat have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. Out from the gloomy past till now we stand at last where the white gleam of our bright star is cast. So the imagery in this verse is harrowing. It's recalling the brutality of enslavement, but it offers hope and optimism as the singer walks in the footsteps of their ancestors to a brighter future. I think that the imagery in this verse really parallels what we were reading in Zygmunt Bauman's work of being able to look back and ahead and see footprints, though in this case, the footprints are filled with blood and tears of those who came before. Taking a complete 180, pilgrimage also offers parallels to love. So I'm thinking of songs like Come Fly With Me, Roy Orbison, I Drove All Night, U2, I Still Haven't Found What I'm Looking For, Simon & Garfunkel, Homeward Bound, I Can Go On, and Can You Tell Where My Music Taste Trends? The song that I'm highlighting here, though, is the Beatles' The Long and Winding Road. In this song, there's an established path that guides the singer to the same place over and over and over again. The long and winding road that leads to your door will never disappear. I've seen that road before. It always leads me here, leads me to your door. But this is a deeply sad song, right? It's written as the Beatles were acrimoniously splitting up, and it describes an unattainable journey, an endless journey, a door the singer never quite reaches. And that's part of the pain of pilgrimage, right? That we're always seeking, we're always traveling to new destinations, always in need of the journey. And if we're lifelong pilgrims, if we use that model that we read about early in this talk in the dictionary, there's no end to pilgrimage but death. So sometimes this pilgrim imagery comes out of the pain we feel as people who have yet to achieve our full potential, who are still seeking meaning and opportunity in our lives. And that's why Jimmy Cliff wrote Many Rivers to Cross really early in his career. Many rivers to cross, but I can't seem to find my way over. Wandering, I am lost as I travel along the white cliffs over. Many rivers to cross, and it's only my will that keeps me alive. I've been up for years, and I merely survive because of my pride. I love Many Rivers to Cross. I think that Jimmy Cliff singing this song is so powerful. I also love cover of the song. You should definitely Google. But I want to offer some criticism to this model if we're going to apply it to pilgrimage, which I believe only I am doing. All of this seeking and never finding seems really romantic in a way. It's easy for us to think of pilgrimage as aimless wandering or wandering motivated by pain at the beginning of the journey that can only be cured with exploration. I want us to think about pilgrimage as deeply purposeful and powerful, as something that we embark upon because we're called to do it, because others need us to do it, because it's necessary to our survival as a human community. So I hope that I haven't ruined those songs for you, but I think it's really interesting to think about the parallels between pilgrimage and how we talk about various issues in terms of movement in the popular world and in popular music. So our next big sweeping statement is that pilgrimage can change the world. This is probably the biggest, most sweeping statement of the day. The pilgrimage model is one that was brilliantly deployed during the civil rights movement. There are myriad examples of pilgrimages that shaped the movement and led to really important changes in American society, politics, and policy. So I want to give you a few examples that we're going to play around with. The most obvious civil rights pilgrimage, I think, is the Freedom Rides, which were a 1961 action challenging unconstitutional segregation on public buses in the South. 436 people participated in approximately 60 freedom rides throughout the South. The main ride departed from Washington, D.C., and made it as far as Jackson, Mississippi, where freedom riders were jailed in incredibly harsh conditions. This pilgrimage into an uncertain future brought national attention to violence against civil rights activists in the South and served as a model for future actions. So there are a lot of other civil rights pilgrimages. The 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, which began with marchers facing incredible brutality on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The 1963 March on Washington, which drew approximately 250,000 people to the National Mall to protest employment discrimination, unfair housing practices, and limitations to voting rights. And of course, Freedom Summer. I see aspects of pilgrimage in the lives of the Little Rock Nine, who risked immense violence to attend high school. I see a pilgrim in Ruby Bridges, who as a 6-year-old girl walked up the steps of the then all-white William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans, Louisiana. Her pilgrimage is immortalized in the Norman Rockwell painting, The Problem We All Live With. And for me, what Ruby Bridges teaches us is that a pilgrimage can be 30 feet. A pilgrimage can be 10 feet. As long as we can apply this imagery and understand the power of pilgrimage. Even the civil rights anthem, We Shall Overcome, has a verse that reflects this pilgrimage theme. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. I live in Jackson, Mississippi, and I recently had the pleasure of attending a town hall meeting led by students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida. These are young people who have faced incredible violence and hatred and have turned that life-altering experience into a movement for change. They developed a tour called March for Our Lives, Road to Change, in which they visited over 80 communities in 24 different states in 60 days, getting young people educated, registered, and motivated to vote. And that is some pilgrimage. And I think they were absolutely borrowing some rhetoric and imagery from the freedom rides in the civil rights movement. In a famous speech delivered at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, just 2 months before his death, Martin Luther King Jr. talked about drum majors. So in the speech, he talks about what he calls the drum major instinct. That is the desire to keep up, to gain recognition and praise for what we do. He talks about the destructive nature of this instinct in our personal lives and in the life of our nation, lamenting America's atrocities in the Vietnam War. But then he talks about the important lessons of his faith, that perhaps we might use our drum major instincts to be more generous, more loving, and more gracious. He says, quote, "Everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love." So then at the end of this speech, which is what most people latch onto, in a painful twist of irony, Dr. King tells the congregation what he would like them to say at his funeral. And then this full section of the speech is in your handout, but I'm just going to highlight one line. Quote, "If you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for justice. Say that I was a drum major for peace. I was a drum major for righteousness." So what's a drum major? The person at the front of the band, leading the way, marching in step with their fellow marchers. You know marching and music. They're marching along with their, and if I may be so bold, that perhaps Martin Luther King would be on board with this metaphor. So from Jewish tradition to popular music to the civil rights movement, the imagery of pilgrimage is everywhere. It's all around us. And if we choose to take up the mantle of pilgrim, there are a few things that it requires of us. So Thoreau's Walking is perhaps most famous because of one line. In wildness is the preservation of the world. It was famously adapted by the Sierra Club as their motto. But the end of the piece is what's most meaningful for me personally. In it, Thoreau encourages us to elevate ourselves in nature, to seek the eternal, to sometimes literally elevate ourselves by climbing mountains or trees. But Thoreau's main message, and I think the key message in the entire essay, is that, quote, we cannot afford not to live in the present, end quote. He asserts that we must respond to the world around us, the world as it is, not the world as we wish it to be or as we remember it. Thoreau doesn't want us to follow Bauman's modern pilgrim, looking back at footprints permanently in the sand. He tells us to rely on what we observe in our travels, to move through even our daily lives as pilgrims, to follow, as he calls it, a newer testament, the gospel according to this moment. Thoreau's conclusion calls on us to eternally seek new horizons. So we saunter to the Holy Land till one day the sun shall shine more brightly than ever he has done, shall perchance shine into our minds and hearts and light up our whole lives with a great awakening light, as warm and serene and golden as on a bankside in autumn, end quote. I think that is beautiful. Before I close, I want to take a few questions. So I don't see any right now, but feel free to keep asking and I'll try to get to them. So if you have questions, please share them. A question that I have for you is, did you love this? My contact information and the website for the ISJL's Southern Jewish Heritage Tour program are included in the back of your handouts. And I would love to hear from you and potentially plan a tour for your community in the future. So if you think of questions after this talk, please shoot me an email. So I just sort of want to summarize some things here as we conclude. We've been talking about pilgrimage. We considered how to define the term, and then thought about other models of travel that compete with or fall short of the idea of pilgrimage. We defined and explored sites of memory as important waypoints on pilgrimages. We talked about pilgrimages' connections to Judaism, music, and the civil rights movement. And we noted that pilgrimage requires our undivided attention. So here's one last thing that pilgrimage asks of us. I'm going to pause here because I see a question. We're going to get to our last point soon. Someone asks, once we go on a pilgrimage and come back, what do we do with that experience? So I think that that's really important. A key element of travel generally is like, okay, how do we tell about it, right? Something that I think about a lot as someone who is not a native Mississippian is sort of the way that I talk about the place where I now live. So when I moved to Mississippi, I didn't know a lot about this place, and it's been an incredible learning experience trying to understand a little bit the South and life in Mississippi. And so often when I leave this state and I am at home, my home state of Pennsylvania, or I'm elsewhere around the world, I like to do what I call spreading the gospel of Mississippi. So telling people who maybe have never been here, have never experienced this amazing state, all about what life is like here, what the community is like here, what culture is like here. So I think that's a really important thing, especially if you're going somewhere that the people around you have never been. Mississippi is not a hugely popular tourist destination, which is why I'm using it as this example. So if you're from a place where a lot of people haven't been to the place where you've just traveled, I think spreading the gospel of that place is a really important thing. And that sort of happens to really fit in well with the imagery of pilgrimage. But I think it's also about learning from the folks who you met on the ground and seeing how you can apply what they're doing in the place where you visited to your home community. We talk about this a lot with our alternative break students who spend a week in Mississippi. They really experience hands-on the service that people are doing in their communities in the Mississippi Delta. And often they'll take that experience and apply it to activism that they're doing in their home places. So I think, again, it's a great way for folks to connect experiences that they have in the place where they travel to their home communities and the work that they do at home. I think that an absolutely essential part of pilgrimage and an obligation of pilgrims is to tell about what we've seen and to apply what we've seen to our lives and to the lives of those around us. So I think that that is a great question. Here's another one. What can we do to encourage people to come to our communities as pilgrims? Ooh, that's a great question. I think one thing to do is to connect with other people in your community. I'm not necessarily sure what type of organization you're from, if you're from a congregation, et cetera. But I think connecting with other folks in your community to sort of build a place that's going to be able to welcome people as pilgrims. That's something. I think connecting with people who are doing really interesting work within your community can help sort of connect you to people who may be traveling there already. And I think just like having a spirit of welcoming and openness on both ends is a way to make that connection. I'm sorry, I don't necessarily have a better answer for you, but I think that, you know, it's about expressing that welcoming and openness and being excited about welcoming folks who maybe have never been to where you are before. Yeah. Okay, here's another question. What are some ways we can be more pilgrimy on our normal travels? I would just first like to say I wish that I had used the word pilgrimy in this talk a lot more, and I'm going to try to fit it in the rest of the time we have together. So my idea with this talk is that we can apply these ideas no matter where we're traveling, how we're traveling, what we're doing. I think it's all about being really mindful, thinking about place in interesting ways, and thinking about the impact that we're having as travelers to a place and the impact that a place has on the people who already live there. I think it's about being really respectful of the communities we're visiting as the experts on that place. And I think it's also about being spontaneous and getting off the beaten path a little bit, and trying to understand, you know, the lived realities of folks where you are, and avoiding those sort of prepackaged experiences to say, okay, like what's real and true here, and that's really, really hard. There's a quote from Moby Dick that I really love, where Ishmael, the main character, is talking about the island where his Polynesian best friend Queequeg is from, and he says, "It's not down on any map. True places never are." And I think that that's a way that we can think about the places that we visit on these pilgrimages, that sometimes the most powerful experience on a trip is going to be something that you didn't plan for or didn't expect. It might be a conversation that you have with someone walking down the street. It might be you walk into a museum that you hadn't planned to visit, and it's like the most amazing thing you've ever seen. And so I think being open to those experiences and knowing that maybe something that's not on your initial itinerary is going to end up being the most powerful part of your trip, is definitely a way to be more pilgrimy. Yes. So thank you so much for all those questions. If you have more, please get in touch. I clearly love to talk about this. So I sort of want to close with one additional idea. This is really the last thing, one more thing that pilgrimage asks of us. And again, this is something that we can apply in our regular travels. This is our last sweeping statement. Pilgrimage requires self-reflection. So as I close here, I want to go back to the Oxford English Dictionary just for a moment to a phrase that's tucked at the bottom of the pilgrim definition among myriad other examples. And it's the phrase pilgrim spirit. So here's an example of it in a sentence from 1752. Quote, "Walk in the pilgrim spirit, thy kindled map high lifted in thy hand," end quote. An example from 1850, quote, "By the free pilgrim spirit nursed within our inmost bosoms, yet," that's a sentence fragment. I'm not sure what the second half of the sentence is going to be. An example from 2001, quote, "The pilgrim spirit has not been subdued by several challenges," end quote. So the Oxford English Dictionary doesn't offer a definition of this phrase, but to me, it's the sense of responsibility and urgency and promise and optimism that comes with the mantle of pilgrim. It's something that we own and uphold and cherish and never take too seriously, even if we've been tasked with giving a lecture about it. So I urge that wherever we travel and wherever we live, we seek to embody this pilgrim spirit of discovery, of respect, of devotion to those who have walked this road before us. And I hope that if you you seek out the Austria. We would love to help make your pilgrimage happen. Thank you so much.